The valet remembered her later as the woman who tipped in cash and said thank you twice, which was more than most people did at the Halloran Pavilion on a night like this. And he would have no reason to think about her again until the news vans started arriving 3 days afterward. Naomi Asante arrived at the gala the way she arrived at most things, which was early, quietly, and on her own terms. She had a driver, but had asked him to drop at the side entrance because she did not enjoy the slow procession of arrivals, the photographs, the practiced way, people air-kissed near a cheek without ever touching it. She came up the marble steps in a charcoal gown that fit her exactly and announced nothing about itself, and she carried a small clutch and her own composure. And she walked into the largest charity event in the city of Charlotte that spring without a single person turning to look. That suited her. She had spent a great deal of her life learning that being unwatched was not the same as being unseen, and that the gap between those two things was where most of the useful information in any room could be found. She was 46. If you had passed her on a sidewalk, you might have registered something steady in the way she moved, a kind of unhurried certainty. But you would not have guessed that the woman walking past you had built a company that processed the digital payments for nearly a third of the small businesses in the American South, that she had taken it from a single rented desk to a valuation that hovered somewhere north of $22 billion, and that she had done all of it starting from a place most people in the Halloran Pavilion that night could not have located on a map and would not have wanted to. Naomi had grown up in a part of Birmingham where the buses stopped running early and the grocery store was a 40-minute walk in each direction. Her mother had cleaned offices at night, and her grandmother had raised her during those hours, and what her grandmother had given her, more than anything else, was a particular kind of attention. Watch how people treat the person who can't do anything for them, her grandmother used to say. That's the only review that counts. Naomi had carried that sentence with her through every room she had ever entered since, and she had never once found a reason to set it down. She had built the company on that same principle, in a way the business press had never quite managed to explain. She hired people other founders overlooked. She paid attention to who was kind when they thought it didn't matter. She had walked away from 3 separate acquisitions and 1 enormous investment partner over the years, each time because of something small she had observed. A tone used with a waiter, a joke made at someone's expense, a casual cruelty that told her everything she needed to know about how a person would behave once the stakes were high and no one was watching. Her board had not always understood these decisions. Her returns had eventually explained them. Tonight was not, strictly speaking, business. The gala raised money for a network of after-school programs across the Carolinas, and Naomi had been a quiet donor to those programs for 11 years, always anonymously, because she remembered, with a clarity that had never faded, what it had meant to have somewhere safe to go between 3 o'clock and the hour her mother came home. She had funded a scholarship that put 14 kids through college every year, and not one of those kids knew her name, and she preferred it that way. But there was a second reason she had come, and only a handful of people knew about it. In a suite on the 4th floor of the adjoining hotel, a small team of attorneys was finalizing the last details of an acquisition that had taken 13 months to assemble. Her company was preparing to absorb a struggling but storied regional logistics firm, a deal valued at $1.5 billion, and the gala had been chosen as a neutral and elegant setting for both sides to confirm their intentions before the signing scheduled for the next morning. Naomi had agreed to this arrangement because she had learned over 2 decades that how people conducted themselves at a party told her more than any quarter of due diligence ever could. The firm she was acquiring belonged by inheritance and by stubborn pride to the Callaway family. Beaumont Callaway was 63 years old, and he had spent most of those years being told he was important. His grandfather had founded the firm in an era when a handshake and a railroad contract were enough to build something that lasted, and his father had grown it carefully and Beaumont had inherited it at 51 with the firm conviction that maintaining a thing was the same as having made it. He sat on the boards of a museum and a hospital and a country club. He had given to the correct charities in the correct amounts. He had spent 3 decades shaking hands at events exactly like this one, and the result was a standing in Charlotte society that felt to him like a law of nature rather than an accident of birth. What Beaumont did not advertise, and what kept him awake more nights than he admitted even to his wife, was that the firm was dying. The logistics business had changed underneath him while he attended Gallus. Margins had thinned. A bad expansion had swallowed a decade of reserves. 2 anchor contracts had quietly not been renewed. The acquisition from Naomi's company was not an opportunity for the Callaways. It was the only thing standing between them and a slow, humiliating dissolution that would erase 4 generations of a name they had treated as permanent. His wife understood none of this, or chose to understand none of it, which amounted to the same thing. Felicity Callaway was 60 and had been the social center of her family's life for as long as anyone could remember. She chaired committees. She decided which charities were serious and which were merely fashionable. She had a talent, honed over decades, for reading a room and placing every hierarchy she had constructed and never once questioned. She did not consider herself unkind. She considered herself a woman of standards, and she had never been forced to examine the difference, because the world she moved through had agreed to call her cruelty by the more flattering name of discernment. Felicity had personally helped design the seating for the VIP reception. That evening, the small roped section near the front, where the most significant donors were to be received before dinner. She knew every name on that list. She had, in fact, memorized it. Naomi made her way toward that section a little after 8, carrying a glass of champagne she had accepted and not tasted, moving through the crowd with the ease of a person comfortable being underestimated. She was nearly to the table marked for her when a woman stepped directly into her path. Felicity had been watching her for almost a minute. The woman in the charcoal gown did not match any name she recognized, and she was moving with too much purpose toward a section that was not open to general guests. And something in Felicity rose up at the sight of it, some old and unexamined certainty about who belonged where. "I'm sorry," Felicity said, in a voice pitched to be heard by the people nearby. "This area is reserved. May I ask how you got back here?" Naomi stopped. She looked at the woman without alarm and without hurry. "I have a seat at this table," she said. "I'm sure there's been a mix-up." Felicity's smile did not reach any part of her face that mattered. "These tickets are very limited. If you'll come with me, we can sort out where you're actually meant to be." Naomi reached into her clutch and produced her invitation, the heavy cream card with her name printed on it in the same typeface as every other guest's, and she held it out. Felicity glanced at it for less than a second and did not take it. "Anyone can have a card," she said. "What I'm asking is whether you belong in this section." Several people had begun to watch. A man in a tuxedo near the bar paused with his drink halfway to his mouth. A couple by the floral arrangement stopped their conversation. Naomi was aware of all of it, the particular quality of a crowd deciding whether to be entertained, and she had stood at the center of versions of this moment more times in her life than she could count. "My name is on the list," she said evenly. "If there's a question, the coordinator can confirm it in 30 seconds. I helped make the list." Felicity's voice had acquired an edge now, the brittle sharpness of a woman whose authority had been questioned in front of an audience. "I think I would remember you." "And yet," Naomi said, "it was a small thing." That answer, 2 words and nothing more. But it was not the reaction Felicity had been expecting. She had expected apology, the small retreat of a person who had been caught somewhere she shouldn't be. Instead, the woman in front of her simply stood there, calm and immovable and entirely unbothered, and that stillness did something to Felicity that the moment did not deserve. She reached out and took Naomi by the upper arm, not gently, the grip of a woman who expected the touch to accomplish what her words had not. who expected this person to be steered toward the exit like a problem being removed. Naomi looked down at the hand on her arm. Then she looked back up. "Take your hand off me," she said, quietly. Not a request. What happened next would be described differently by each of the people who witnessed it, but they would all agree on the sound. Felicity let go of her arm, and then, in a motion that seemed to come from somewhere older and more frightened than the present moment, she drew her hand back and brought it hard across Naomi's face. The slap cracked across the room. The quartet had just finished a piece, and into that pocket of silence, the sound landed like something dropped from a great height. Heads turned, all across the front of the ballroom. Phones came up, and then nothing. No one moved, no one stepped forward. 40 people had seen it, and not one of them did a single thing. And afterward, when they tried to explain why, the best any of them could manage was that they had been too stunned, and that by the time the shock passed, the moment had already closed over itself like water. Naomi did not stagger. She did not raise a hand to her cheek, not at first. She stood exactly where she was and let the sting bloom and recede. And she looked at the woman who had struck her with an expression that contained no fury and no tears, only a kind of terrible and complete attention, as though she were filing something away. She had been here before. Not this exact room, but this exact place. This position at the center of a crowd that had decided in advance what she was, and had felt entitled to act on the decision. She had learned a long time ago that the moment of being struck is the most expensive moment to spend on anger, because anger empties you of the one thing the other person does not have, which is clarity. So she held it. She did not swallow the insult, and she did not perform it. She set it down carefully inside herself, in a place where it would keep, where it could be used rather than wasted. After a moment, she touched her cheek with 2 fingers, almost clinically, confirming a fact. Then she lowered her hand. Felicity, for her part, seemed to expect something. A flinch, a retreat, some collapse that would confirm she had restored the proper order of things. When none of it came, she smoothed the front of her gown and half turned away, as if the matter were settled, and her husband appeared at her elbow, having crossed the room toward the sound. He listened to her low, quick account, with his head bowed, and then, audibly enough for the people nearest them to hear, Beaumont Calloway said that she had likely done the right thing, that someone had to maintain standards, that these events drew all sorts now. Naomi heard it. She gave no sign that she had. She stood there a moment longer, in the precise spot where it had happened, because to move from it would have felt like being moved, and she would not give them that. Then she reached into her clutch and took out her phone. She did not look around for sympathy. She did not search the faces of the people who had watched and done nothing. She made a single call, and it lasted under 20 seconds, and the only words anyone near her could make out were the last 2. "Pause everything," she said, and she ended the call and put the phone away and walked to her seat and sat down and picked up the menu card, as though deciding, calmly, what she might like for dinner. 4 floors up, in the hotel suite, the call was received by a man named Theodore Boncoli, who had been Naomi's general counsel for 8 years and who understood from the brevity of the instruction that no part of it was open to discussion. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference between her voice when she was weighing a thing and her voice when she had already weighed it. He did not ask why. He made 2 calls of his own inside the next 5 minutes. By the time the dinner service had begun downstairs, the term sheet was frozen, and the signing scheduled for 9 the next morning had been cancelled. The deal that had taken 13 months and the patient labor of more than 40 people across 4 firms, the deal that had been, 90 minutes earlier, the most certain thing on everyone's calendar, was simply gone. Not delayed, not renegotiated. Gone. The Callaways did not know yet. Beaumont was at the bar describing the morning's schedule to 2 men from the banking side, pleased with himself, relaxed in the way of a man who believes the hard part is finished. Felicity had rejoined a cluster of women near the orchids and was recounting the earlier unpleasantness in the satisfied tone of someone who had handled an inconvenience. The first crack in the evening came from a man named Harlan Pierce, who sat on the finance committee of the consortium backing the acquisition, and who stepped away from a conversation after glancing at his phone with a face that emptied of color so suddenly that two people near him asked if he was all right. He crossed the room directly to Beaumont and touched his elbow and leaned in and said three words. "The deal's dead." Beaumont laughed, the short, automatic laugh of a man who is certain he has misheard. Then he saw Harlan's face and the laugh died in his throat. He asked what he meant. Harlan told him. The acquisition had been frozen 15 minutes ago by direct order of the chief executive of the acquiring company, who had given the instruction by phone from inside this building during this event. Beaumont set down his glass. He asked who that was. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said the name, Naomi Asante. The understanding arrived in Beaumont the way the full force of a collision arrives a second after the impact. He had known in the abstract that the final approval rested with the CEO of the acquiring firm, a name on documents, a person he had never bothered to picture as a person. He had assumed, without ever deciding to assume it, that someone of that stature would send a delegate to an event like this, that she would arrive surrounded by an entourage, that he would know her when he saw her. The woman in the charcoal gown who had stood alone near the VIP rope had matched nothing in the picture he had built, and the picture had been built entirely out of his own assumptions, and not a single fact. That was the part that would keep him awake. Not that his wife had made an error, that he had made it first, silently and completely, weeks before she ever crossed the room. He turned and looked toward the front of the ballroom. He could see Naomi from where he stood, seated, upright, perfectly composed, reading something on her phone, with the unbothered air of a woman who had nowhere she would rather be, and nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. A board member from the buyers' consortiums recognized her next, near the dessert table, and went rigid, and turned to a colleague, and the colleague turned, and the circle of comprehension widened the way these things do, person by person, until it reached Felicity, who was summoned to her husband's side, expecting to be told something she could manage. What she was told instead required several full seconds to enter her. Not because it was complicated, but because accepting it meant dismantling a certainty she had held since the instant she had crossed the room. She had been so sure. She had been sure the woman did not belong, sure she was in the wrong place, sure of it in a way that had felt like knowledge and had been, she now understood, only the oldest and ugliest kind of guessing. The first thing that reached her face was not shame. It was a draining of color, a fear that arrived before any understanding could. Beaumont crossed the ballroom toward Naomi's table with the doomed urgency of a man chasing something that had already left. He had assembled words on the way, a careful sequence meant to convey humility while leaving a door propped open, some adequate acknowledgment of the error that might yet retrieve what had been lost. He reached the edge of her table and cleared his throat, and said her name with the full ceremonial weight of it, as though pronouncing it correctly now might make up for not having known it an hour ago. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He said his wife had not been in possession of the proper information. He said he hoped they could find a way past an unfortunate misunderstanding between people of goodwill. Naomi let the words arrive and settle. She did not stand. She did not invite him to sit. "I understand what you're trying to say," she said at last quietly, without heat, "and I believe you mean it. But I want to be clear with you about something, because I think you've misunderstood what happened here." He waited. "You're apologizing because you found out who I am," she said. "You're sorry that the woman your wife struck turned out to matter. That's not the same as being sorry she struck her. Your wife didn't make a mistake about my name. She made a decision about how a stranger deserves to be treated. A stranger who could do nothing for her, who she believed was no one. That decision is the same whether I run a company or clean the floors of this building. The only thing that's changed in the last hour is that it became expensive." Felicity had followed her husband and stood a few feet back, and now she stepped forward and began to say, "What you have to understand." Naomi looked at her, just briefly, and then returned her attention to Beaumont, and Felicity's sentence died unfinished. I built my company on one rule, Naomi said. I watch how people treat the person who can't do anything for them. That's the whole evaluation. Everything else is just paperwork. She paused. An hour ago, your family showed me exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching. I believe you. And I cannot hand $1.5 billion to people who needed me to be somebody before they'd let me be a person. The room had stopped pretending not to listen. The quartet was playing something low, and the music had lost all its power to cover anything. There's one more thing, Naomi said, and her voice did not change at all. What your wife did tonight wasn't rudeness. It was assault in front of 40 witnesses, several of whom were recording. I've already spoken to my attorney. He's spoken to the police. An officer will be here within the hour, and your wife will be charged, and I will not be quietly persuaded to make that go away. Because the last time a woman like me let a thing like this slide for the sake of someone else's comfort, it cost more than any deal ever could. She looked back down at the menu card. You're welcome to wait with her until they arrive. And that was the end of it. The officer arrived at 20 minutes to 10, and the gala absorbed the sight of it the way a crowd absorbs anything it will be discussing for years, with a terrible and electric quiet. Felicity Calloway was not handcuffed in front of the orchids. The officer was more discreet than that, but she was escorted out through the side entrance, with her husband trailing behind her. And the people in that ballroom watched a woman who had spent 30 years deciding who belonged be walked out of a room she had helped design. The formal consequences came faster than the social ones. By midnight, the consortium's lawyers had confirmed the withdrawal of the offer. By the next afternoon, the story had moved through the private channels of the city's business community, with the unstoppable momentum of a thing too concrete to soften into rumor. Carried not by anyone Naomi knew, but by the simple weight of a true thing that refused to be compressed. Two reporters had it by the second day. The Callaway firm's communications team, unprepared for a crisis their plan had never imagined, issued a statement calling the evening a private misunderstanding between individuals. And it did not use the word slap, and it did not mention Naomi, and it did not work. Felicity was charged with misdemeanor assault. She paid a fine and completed a diversions program, and the criminal matter did not end at all. But the other matter did not. The thing she had built her entire life upon, the certainty of her own discernment, the belief that her read on a person was the same as the truth of them, had collapsed in a single evening in front of everyone who mattered to her, and no amount of private rationalizing could reassemble it. She had been wrong, and she had been wrong publicly, and the wrongness had not been small or abstract. It had been the kind that takes a family's future down with it. Beaumont spent the following weeks in a state his oldest friends would have called grief if they had been allowed close enough to see it. Not for the deal alone, though the firm entered a restructuring within the month, on terms far worse than the ones it had thrown away. He grieved the story he had told himself for 63 years, that his family's standing was the product of merit and conduct, and not merely the inertia of a name, and that story had been revised in front of an entire ballroom of people who had once believed it too. Naomi did not celebrate any of it. She drove home that night with her phone face down on the passenger seat and let herself feel, in the dark and alone, everything she had not permitted herself to feel under the chandeliers, and then she set it down for good. She spoke about the evening exactly once, 10 days later, to her leadership team, and she did not dramatize it or frame it as a victory. She said only that the evaluation of a partner is never confined to the financial documents. That character shows itself in the moments when no one important seems to be watching, and that the decision had been consistent with the standards the company had held from its first day. Then she asked them to find the next candidate and moved to the following item on the agenda. Months later, her company completed a different acquisition, a smaller firm with less history and more decency, whose leadership she had watched across 3 meetings treat their junior staff exactly as well as they treated her. The deal closed in a plain conference room with a handshake and no ceremony. The integration went well. She read the quarterly reports that followed with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had built something real on a foundation she had chosen, rather than one she had been handed. She thought about that night only rarely after that. When she did, what stayed with her was not the slap and not the deal, but a single sentence her grandmother had given her in a kitchen in Birmingham a lifetime ago, about watching how people treat the ones who can do nothing for them. She had spent her whole life learning that the people who are quickest to tell you that you don't belong in a room are very often the ones who will one day have to account for you the most completely, and that the surest answer to being told you are no one is to remain, calmly and entirely, exactly who you are, and to keep building until the room itself belongs to you. That was what she had done. That was what she would keep doing. And the woman who had been struck in front of 40 silent witnesses was the same woman who had carried $22 billion out of a neighborhood where the buses stopped running early, which meant she had known, long before any of them, precisely how a small thing begins and exactly what it can be made to become.